So, welcome to Lesson 5, How the USA Increased the Rivalry. You would probably be not blamed if you, at this point in your learning about what happened at the early stages of the Cold War, if you were to suggest, for instance, that it was largely the fault of the Soviet Union, why a division, a rivalry increased between the West and the East. What we need to understand, and one sort of, as I say, learning trouble spot, is that the blame needs to be shared around between the United States and the USSR, or the Soviet Union, because although the Soviet Union doesn't do a heck of a lot of good, they take over a lot of countries, they institute a relatively rigid, strict system of control that's not particularly nice if you're a citizen of Eastern Europe or any one of the countries. The United States doesn't necessarily make life easy on Comrade Stalin, and in many ways pushes Stalin to take a relatively aggressive line. So we're going to look at today how the United States contributed to the beginning of the Cold War between 1945 and 1949.
So we're going to be looking at the first part of this, is something called the Truman Doctrine. There are two major points. Now, we're looking at essentially the period 1945 to 1947 up until now. So that's lesson 3, 4, and this lesson 5 is essentially how do we go from World War II, where they are all bestie buddies, BFFs, to 1947, where the Cold War pretty much has officially started. And the Truman Doctrine is seen as a nice turning point of the start of the Cold War. So we're going to look at Greece and why we get to that, what happens in Greece, and how that in turn caused the Truman Doctrine. Now, this is an introduction, and we're going to talk about this in more detail. But when we look at why Truman creates the Truman Doctrine, there are three major reasons. Number one, Truman, who is, as you remember from Potsdam, a lot less suspicious of the intentions of Stalin, believed genuinely that the Soviet Union was trying to spread communism and essentially take over the world with communists, or at least get a massive bulk of communist support through Eastern Europe, then to the West, and then beyond. He sees the Soviet expansion to some extent as not stopping at Eastern Europe, but as a mission to essentially take over the world. The USA as well had the A-bomb in 1947, which it knew the Soviets were inventing, but at this point in time, that gives them a huge advantage. So if me and Mr. Raine sat in this room right here, and say Mr. Raine is Mr. Raine, he's a burly chap, but let's be honest, he's a bit past his prime, and I've got a shotgun.
A little bit of a lover, not a fighter.
And I've got a shotgun. Now, I have a weapon which can easily outclass anything Mr. Raine produces, so I can basically tell him what to do. And Truman is aware that with this A-bomb, he has the power. Now, Truman knows, much like Mr. Raine's going to get a shotgun in a couple of years, and then we're about equal. But while I have the advantage, I might as well try and get as much as possible. And the last big reason why we see the emergence of the Truman Doctrine, the thing which convinces the rest of America, if not Truman, that we need Truman Doctrine, is Greece.
Now, what happens in Greece? At Yalta, the second conference, it's agreed between Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union that Britain would continue to have influence in Greece. The British Army fought heavily in Greece against the Italians and the Germans in the Second World War. Some really interesting side reading if you want to read about the invasion of Crete and some of the commando raids and so on and so forth. But the British fought over Greece quite heavily, and as such, they'd always had, well, really since World War I anyway, a large degree of influence in the Greek government. Britain had been supporting, at the end of the war, a royalist government against a fight that was fighting a communist insurgency. Now, in 1944, the Nazis are expelled from Greece, and they basically lose control. The Greek government is ceded back to the royal family who controlled Greece and had controlled Greece at that time. But the Greeks saw this potentially, this sort of World War II as a potential for a new form of government. And there are a lot of left-leaning people in Greece who supported the ideals of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and saw the communist revolution in Russia as something positive, and decided that Greece could be a good country or a good candidate to go to communism, and it had pretty widespread support amongst the Greeks. And they started a communist insurgency. So the British are trying to reinstate a royalist government. At the same time, a communist rebellion breaks out of Greeks against this royalist government, and the British basically helped the royalist government crush this communist rebellion. However, unfortunately, it doesn't go on. It doesn't go away. They fight they use covert guerrilla war tactics. It's a real messy affair. And in 1946, the British government, in conjunction with the royal family, agree that that free and fair elections will be held in Greece. And in these elections in 1946, the communists are heavily defeated by the royalists. They refuse to give up and continue again a harsh guerrilla war, and they're aided by neighboring communist countries, which of course include countries like Albania and Romania, Yugoslavia even, in fighting the British and fighting the government. Now, that takes us up to 1947, and by 1947 the British government had 40,000 soldiers stationed in Greece. You need to understand what's happening in Britain after the war now. Britain had fought 2 world wars in the span of 30 years as a principal combatant. Their empire had been shrunk, both in Asia by the Japanese. They had lost places like Hong Kong and Singapore, though they would get them back after the war. They could no longer, because of the outright expense of this largely, afford to keep all of their colonies and afford to pay for its empire. Britain had racked up humongous debts, absolutely mind-boggling debts, fighting the Nazis in the Second World War, most of which was owed to the Americans, and the British government was effectively broke. At the same time, you have some of its cash centers, like the colonies of India, begging for independence, and by 1947, most observers would have concluded that India will be independent within a year, in fact, which it was. So in 1947, the British government looked at its expense centers and they said, okay, where can we save money? We're broke. And they look at Greece. They have this, it's relatively tumultuous because there's a rebel insurgency. It's costing them a fortune. They have a ton of people there. And they say to the United States, the largest country and most rich country in the world at that point, that they can no longer afford to keep the Greek government afloat. And Greeks could, when they pull out, fall to a communist insurgency. The United States, realizing that Greece is an important bulwark, a country that's located next to communist countries, for the capitalist West, and is afraid to lose Greece to Soviet expansion. And in 1947, the United States steps in with financial aid to prevent Soviet takeover.
Excellent. So this starts what is known as the Truman Doctrine. Now, this is announced in an important speech in 1947 and is seen as a turning point. That means a key moment of change in the US foreign policy. Between 1945 and 1947, the USA has been curiously absent. It hasn't got involved. There's an isolationist idea within America that we got involved in a second war, we've lost loads of soldiers, it wasn't worth it, let's go back to looking after our own affairs. Let Europe be Europe. However, following Greece, Truman now pushes America to a policy of containment known as the Truman Doctrine. I'm going to stop here and explain what's going on. So, imagine there is a fight there's disagreement between geography and history. Okay, so we've got on one side our heavyweight, Mr. Raine, Mr. Davis, all that, and Miss Toff. And on the other hand, we've got Mr. Waterhouse and Miss Furzy, etc.
Number of lightweights.
Yeah. But it's roughly even, should we say. But there's a couple of departments which are undecided. So say if suddenly geography starts getting MFL, and then we look at our numbers, and suddenly they outnumber us. Okay, so we need to make sure that we get someone very quickly on our side. So we go and put in science, and they're going to pull in maybe another department, and so on and so on. Essentially, you can't allow someone, your opponent, in this case Russia, to take your allies away from you. Because if you let them take one ally, they might take another ally. They might take another ally. And suddenly it's just you versus the entire world. It's better to stop them from day one, and in this case from Greece, to stop them taking away the allies of Greece, and then defending that, then let them slowly eat away at you. And if you believe that, like Truman does, that Stalin is planning to one by one take over the entire world, you start from day one. And this is the idea of containment. If I am containing something, like a bee, I am not destroying it, but I'm stopping it from getting out, or stopping it from getting any further. So the idea is communism has got as far in Eastern Europe as it has. We can't fight that, it's not worth fighting it. But we can stop it from going any further.
Contain its growth.
Contain how much it's grown. So this becomes solved by Truman for the idea that the USA is bound by duty, by democracy and freedom, to keep people from the spread of communist Eastern Europe. In reality, yes, there is, I'm sure, an ideological and idea that no, we don't like communism because it's not free, and it certainly is what is used to some extent to sell containment, i.e. spending lots of money on weapons and paying other countries for free. Sell containment to the American people, i.e. we need to stop the spread of communism because they ain't freedom-loving Americans like us. However, there is a real geopolitical international relations aspect here, i.e. we need to make sure that we don't lose our allies, because if a fight comes, we need as many friends as possible, particularly ones in key locations such as Greece, which happens to be almost behind the Iron Curtain, and maybe an opportunity to send troops in. Although that's a long way off and not planning any war, but it's good to have the option if you can. So, this argued, therefore, the USA should get involved by providing money, or in some cases soldiers, to stop countries which might turn communist from going communist. And we will see this pattern of Truman Doctrine going all the way up into the Vietnam War. Time and again, where there's like Korean War, you might know, for example, North Korea, we're jumping ahead a little bit, North Korea is half and half capitalist and communist. This was a place where in the future there will be a battle between communist and capitalist. Wherever there is a communist uprising, the USA sees it as its job to spend money and military to stop it getting any further.
So the Truman Doctrine has some many varied and important consequences. The first important consequence, of course, is that the Greek royalist government is able to defeat the communist insurgency. With the influx of American money and weapons, they're able to defeat the communists and prevent a communist takeover of Greece, unlike other countries in Eastern Europe. It dramatically increases the rivalry between the USA and the USSR, because we have here, for the first time, the United States saying the communists can grow no longer, and we will do whatever we can with our economic power and our loads of money to train the people who are fighting the communists and prevent them from expanding. Truman will go out and say the world is divided between the free non-communists and the unfree communists. The USA becomes committed, more so than it ever had been in its history before, to this policy of containment, and much, much, much more involved in European affairs. And then, as a consequence of this, it will decide on the Marshall Plan. I alluded to this last lesson. We're going to go into it in great detail. The Marshall Plan and the spending of United States dollars for the recovery of the economic recovery of Europe will lead Stalin, of course, to set up a similar organization in common form to unite the communist parties of Eastern Europe and in worldwide and common action against the United States. So what it does is it really increases the tension in the organizations that are working to against each other, if you will, on both the Russian side and the American side.
Now, you might have heard the phrase, prevention is better than cure. And to some extent, the Marshall Plan is the prevention to the Truman Doctrine's cure, i.e. we now have an infestation of communists. That's Truman Doctrine that by sending soldiers and money. Soldiers and money for guns and for armies to fight the communists. The Marshall Plan looks to prevent communism even taking root. Now, this is the same idea. We need to contain communism, but even before communists might take over. And this is based on the belief that across Europe, there are economically devastated countries, infrastructure destroyed, houses destroyed, industries destroyed, people are unhappy, people are shifting to the left. In Britain, for example, we see the first proper Labour government under Clement Attlee in 1945, and we see the rise of stuff like the welfare state, NHS, and even Britain's going left-wing to some extent. So there's a fear that in the ashes of World War II, that because of the poverty and because of the economic problems, people will naturally, because they're poor, err on the side and go towards communism. So what does he need to do? He needs to really sell capitalism and keep people capitalist. So what does he do? Give them money. Marshall Plan, General George Marshall, very, very organised chap, sends over billions of dollars to Europe, to individual countries in Europe, in order to help with their economy. For example, our NHS is entirely funded by Marshall Plan. If the Marshall Aid had not come, we could not have afforded, on top of all our debts or reconstruction, the NHS. This money was to be going to rebuilding stuff, but also keeping the governments afloat. If people see capitalist democracies giving you stuff like the NHS, funded by American dollars, but let's keep that quiet, then people go, you know what, this capitalism, this democracy lasts all not so bad. and then they stay loyal to capitalism, and more important, they stay loyal to the American side of the fence. This also helps, and this is a sort of more smug AA style point, that if you, as soon as you give people money, they're kind of dependent on you. Like, they know they owe you a favour, but more than that, if they want any more money, like, they got to keep you sweet. So it gives you some degree of indirect influence over the government. Oh yeah, you plan to do that? Well, that's a shame, because I was planning to give you all this bajillions of pounds, but clearly you don't want it. Oh, you have changed your mind. Fantastic. That gives you, and as long as you don't take the mick, it gives you some degree of influence. So, the Marshall Plan is the idea that in order to give people reasonable prosperity so they don't feel like they have to turn to communism, we give them money. Now, this is called the European Recovery Plan, but was nicknamed the Marshall Plan. And it comes not just in terms of cash, but as machinery, food, technological assistance, and in return, they would buy the US goods to allow US companies to invest in their industries. This is basically to sell it to Congress, the American people. It's not just giving free money. Interestingly, this was offered to Eastern Europe, but as you can see in the picture, Stalin doesn't like the idea of American aid being given to the East, and therefore he blocks it.
So actually, just on that last point, you notice that I've put in, and we've put in a lot of cartoons in here. One of the aspects of this course that's a little bit unusual compared to, you will have some sources to deal with, and as such, you'll need to be able to understand and interpret political cartoons in light of what you know about the historical event. So that's just an aside, but one of the things we're going to move on to now is what are the consequences of the Marshall Plan, this direct involvement. U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall, the guy who the Marshall Plan was named for, will create an organization to dole out that money called the Organization for European Economic Recovery, the OEEC. By 1953, 17 billion American dollars are provided to rebuild the economies of Western European countries.
The only ones who accept the money.
The ones who accept the money. And to raise the standard of living. Europe, as a result of this, becomes more firmly divided between the East and the West. Stalin will withdraw the USSR from discussions on the Marshall Plan because he didn't trust the United States and didn't want to show how weak the economic situation was in the Eastern Bloc. So he prevents very much the Eastern European satellite states through organizations like Common Forum and CONICON from participating in Marshall aid and seeing the amount of money and what was possible in terms of rebuilding the economies with this money. And as such, really you have a West that rebuilds, gets actually quite economically successful, contrary to an East which Stalin is increasingly keeping economically backward for the purposes of control, and a division of USSR is firmly established at this point.
If you want to sort of understand why Stalin opposes it, imagine a situation if, because of his entrenched poverty, Mr. Raine hadn't have money, so I buy his wife his nice seafood dinner. He's not going to like that. It'll make him look weak and poor, and therefore he's not going to let me.
Good analogy. So Stalin used the United States, or really, accused the United States of using its money to sort of further its interests in Western Europe. And of course, this is something the United States denies, saying that their money was completely altruistic, that they just wanted to help. In reality, Stalin was probably right. The United States did use the Marshall Plan to gain control and influence over Western Europe and to dominate it, really. It also helped boost the United States economy because it indebted these countries to the United States, who paid back the money with interest.
And also they have to buy American stuff.
Of course. So what did the USSR think? He called the ruling gang of American imperialists has taken the path of open expansion, of enslaving weakened capitalist countries. It has hatched the new war plans against the Soviet Union. Imitating Hitler, the new aggressors are using blackmail.
Harsh stuff.
This is a relatively harsh opinion of the Marshall Plan, expounded by a man named Malenkov, who was a Soviet politician. He said this about the Marshall Plan in 1947. Needless to say, the Russians were suspicious. They hated it and saw it as an American plot for control, which increased the rivalry dramatically between the USSR and the United States in the post-war period.
It's seen definitely as American attempts to take control for their money. They're like insidious capitalists always do. From one insidious capitalist to another.
We wish you all the best. Next lesson, we're going to get into, now that the lines are drawn, And we know that the ideological divisions are insurmountable in the post-war world. What happens next?
This is the start of the official Cold War.